I realize that I'm all that stands between a long day of seminars and dinners, so I'll try to keep it fairly brief and on the light side, trying to strike somewhat of a balance between the complexity of Hans Hoppe and the humor of Walter Block. So those are two of my intellectual idols, so I'll try to merge those two in this talk. Before I begin, I always like to start either with a cartoon or a picture. I think that sometimes can summarize better than I can in words all the comments I'd like to make. So here's one from one of my favorite websites. I don't know if everyone can see this well. I highly recommend this website. One of our it really does exist. I've been accused of moonlighting and creating this website in my free time, but my son's the only artistic one in our family. I'm a totally literary, algebraic person, not a visual person, but it's despair.com, and it has a bunch of pictures that you can use for desktop, or you can actually purchase this one here to decorate your desk, or you can get a wall painting. And this one actually was just produced within the last week. I'm on the email distribution list, and I saw that they just produced one called Government. So if you can't read it that well, it says Government. It's a resplendent picture of the Congress at twilight's last gleaming. It says Government, and then beneath it is the caption, if you think the problems we create are bad, just wait until you see our solutions. To me, in the financial markets, so that's an extremely topical picture. I was just trying to think of the analogy of this to the act that just was passed over the weekend in a quiet emergency session of the Senate and then signed by President Bush this week, the new Protecting American Homeowners Act of 2008, which I think should have been relabeled Let's Perpetuate the Housing Disaster in Perpetuity Act of 2008, but instead it was given a much kinder name. But to me, the whole so-called housing crisis is really summed up in this picture. The housing problems that we have are in large part due to many of the actions taken by the monetary authorities and the Congress over the last 40 or 50 years. At the root of the problem was the creation of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, with all the moral hazard entailed in those government-sponsored enterprises, their ability to borrow cheaply because of the implied government guarantee enabled them to leverage their balance sheets and really fuel the housing boom that became a bubble. And then you had the Community Reinvestment Act, which encouraged, if not implicitly mandated, the development of a subprime lending market with lax standards. And so and then last but not least, you had Alan Greenspan lowering rates and keeping interest rates low after the internet bubble burst in the early 2000s. He kept real rates artificially low for perhaps a 2-year period, and that really got the housing boom in full gear. The housing markets nationally went up 150 to 200% in price over a 4-year period, and now they're kind of retracing painfully, slowly but surely, to their normal trend line, which is generally to kind of track the rate of inflation over time. So we had the government at the root of the crisis, and now just wait until you see their solution, which is to make the guarantee to Fannie and Freddie not implicit but explicit, being willing to buy its equity, encouraging it to lever more. Everyone in the private sector is trying to de-lever in this fierce environment, treacherous environment. That's normally what you do when a recession is facing you, but Fannie's being encouraged to lever up the balance sheet more. Why not? If profit's privatized and risk is socialized, I guess that's the rational thing to do. And then we have moratoria on foreclosures being selected, aid being redistributed from the prudent people that want to buy homes cheaply to those that were imprudent and are caught in their homes now. So the solutions undoubtedly and unfortunately will prolong the crisis. So that's a long digression. Let's go to what I really want to talk about. When I called Lou, I said, I'm not a trained economist or on the faculty of the Mises Institute, what do you want me to talk about in my time here? And he said, well, maybe you could just elaborate on what value Austrian economic and libertarian theory has had for your own career in investments, and then if you have any time left over after that to make fun of Alan Greenspan or to get in digs about the government, feel free to do that. I'm sure they'd appreciate some juicy anecdotes from the investment world. So that's kind of my agenda here. The personal value of Austrian economics and libertarian theory to me is that it basically has enabled me to unlearn everything I have been taught at those prestigious institutions that I attended that Lou mentioned in his kind bio to me, and that covers history, economics, political philosophy. Maybe I was lucky that I majored in English literature, because that meant that the majority of my coursework at the undergraduate level was not in economics, so I wasn't irreparably harmed by my Ivy League education there. I was a fairly blank slate. And so I would say in all candor that unlearning is extremely valuable, and I want to give some examples of the unlearning, which is to explode a variety of government myths about the market and the economy, and then finally unlearning entails defending the market undefendables, borrowing a title from Walter Block's great book, and I list a few of these financial undefendables down below: raiders, speculators, short sellers, vultures. The populist politicians and the media would have you believe that these are the greatest scallywags and reprobates out there, but we actually think they perform a valuable, useful role in capital markets. Okay, on unlearning, I always like to refer to a few quotes. I think it all starts with Mark Twain, who was a 19th century libertarian, and these are three of my favorite quotes from Twain. Education does consist mainly of what we have unlearned. Hopefully you've done a great deal of unlearning at the Mises University this week. Secondly, and this really I think applies, I've never let my schooling interfere with my education. Education is entirely a lifelong pursuit, the pursuit of knowledge and trying to find out what the truth is, and schooling can help. It can impede that process, but it's certainly a different concept. And then finally, and I would say this certainly applies to my investment career, it's one reason the investment markets are fascinating and humbling. Education is the path from cocky ignorance to miserable uncertainty. Almost sounds like a line Woody Allen would have come up with in one of his bleak existential movies. Okay, here's my unlearning in terms of economic theory, and I do think there are some interesting parallels between Austrian economic theory and what we at our firm have applied to the investment world and kind of how we run our business. Our business, we're a hedge fund of funds, so we basically put together a package of hedge fund managers. We hope that the package we put together provides a absolute return that's relatively independent of what the markets are doing. So our true skill is trying to find managers that have an edge and putting together a package of those kinds of managers. The main tenets of the Austrian economic philosophy are that man acts in a world of imperfection and scarcity, that those actions take place through time under conditions of uncertainty. And that's very different from mainstream economic theory, which tends to rely on this model of efficient markets or perfect competition or quantitative techniques for figuring out economics as if it were a mathematical science instead of a judgmental philosophic science. So those insights, I think, do apply to how we think about the investment world. We decidedly think that markets are not perfectly efficient, and we think that's an impossibility. It's a process that tends to be efficient over time, but the process takes place through time, and it involves man and differing tastes, so it's definitely, markets in our view are inefficient. The market is, over the long term, an efficient discounting mechanism, but in the short term it can be an inefficient extrapolating mechanism. So what does that mean to us? Contrary to most of academic finance that thinks markets are perfectly efficient and that you can't make money in the market, we think that markets are highly inefficient and that there are often gaping misvaluations and overvaluations and undervaluations in asset classes and securities. And so that's why we invest the bulk of our capital with hedge funds, managers that go long and short sale different asset classes and securities. And if you just look at the last 7 years, which is a period we've been in operation, there have been plenty of opportunities to exploit each of those. You had tremendous overvaluation in internet and technology stocks back in the 2001 period. At the same time, you had very cheap stocks in the publicly traded REIT market. Commodity markets 5 or 6 years ago were really cheap. Emerging markets were cheap. So there were a lot of pockets of extreme under and overvaluation, and a manager that was skillful could make investments exploiting those opportunities. Secondly, most of modern academic finance relies on quantitative theory. We think quantitative theory and quantitative investing are highly flawed. We pick managers that engage in pure fundamental stock picking, trying to build portfolios one idea at a time. Quantitative techniques can be useful as a screening tool, but at bottom, investing is based on judgment, and investing is more of an art than it is a science. And I think that's a very interesting parallel to the way the Austrians think about economic theory. Thirdly, we tend to fret top down, but we invest bottom up, and we're kind of microeconomic in how we invest, and I think Austrian theory is largely a microeconomic theory based on the unit of man acting. Fourthly, the Austrians place a lot of emphasis on action occurring through time and under conditions of uncertainty, and most of academic finance tends to bemoan the fact that actions take place under time and uncertainty, and they're trying to hold up this idealized model of perfect competition or perfect man. And we instead don't think it's something to be bemoaned. We try to use time and uncertainty to our advantage. We try to find managers who have an edge in what they do. That edge can be from superior information, from taking a different time horizon, or just exercising better judgment. Finally, though, on this page, although Austrian economics, I think, has been extremely helpful to me, as has libertarian political theory, at bottom, I think Austrian economics and investing, while related, are really ultimately separate disciplines, and it's not a necessary or sufficient precondition that one has to be an Austrian to be a good investor. We know plenty of good investors that are statist or redistributionist. I was just thinking that Warren Buffett, perhaps the greatest investor of the 20th and 21st century, is a tremendous statist and redistributionist. His father, Howard Buffett, was a tremendous libertarian thinker and good friend of Murray Rothbard, but he was not. He was mainly a congressman. So you have one that's a great libertarian thinker that ends up in Congress, and one who's a socialist and has probably a political philosophy that ends up being a great investor. So I think Austrian economics is helpful in the way I think about the world, but at bottom, the skill of investing involves a lot of different skill sets. Okay, now I'd like to move from unlearning to untruth. Those are the untruths are probably the other tenet of my education, and here I have, again, I think some useful quotes. It's amazing how some of the communists come up with great quotes. Lenin, a lie told often enough becomes truth. Alice Carroll from Through the Looking Glass. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. Carroll also said, why, sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Mark Twain again, the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between lightning and the lightning bug. And then finally, familiar motto from 1984 by George Orwell, war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. I think that was been the mantra of the Bush administration. so let's look at some government untruths about the markets and the economy, and I have these in several categories. The first category, category one, I call statistical manipulation. The BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, produces most of the statistics that are reported in the papers about unemployment, inflation, and how the economy is doing. Fred Hickey, a great investment strategist who writes a newsletter called the High-Tech Newsletter, said the BLS doesn't stand for the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It stands for the Bureau of Lies and Shenanigans. So here are a few. The unemployment rate, the BLS, and I'm comparing it to this website called shadowstats.com that I think it's published by a guy named John Williams, who must be a libertarian or Austrian at heart. I've never met him. I don't know if Lou or any of you have, but he has devoted this website to looking beneath the statistical reporting of all of these major economic statistics in terms of the methodology that's used, and he comes up with kind of an alternative calculation that's typically based on how these measures might have been calculated 20 or 30 years ago before the statistical manipulation became really rampant. So the unemployment rate, the latest reading was 5.5% year over year. The shadow stat rate is 13.9% for unemployment. And so some of the major differences between the two is the 5.5% is a result of a manipulation added actually during the Clinton administration, proving that Republicans and Democrats are kind of equally culpable of stretching the truth. But the Clinton administration defined away from the unemployment statistics a category called discouraged workers, which was workers that were, kind of given up looking for a job. So if you give up looking for a job, you no longer count as part of the unemployed workforce. So the rates kind of artificially kept low. They also have this new technique that was added a few years ago that's called the birth-death adjustment that tries to account for, because they can't possibly survey every business out there, so they try to kind of dream up jobs that are naturally dying or naturally creating, trying to figure out. It's basically grabbed out of thin air, and miraculously more jobs keep getting added through that manipulation. Over the past 6 months, this birth-death adjustment has actually added workers in the financial sector and the construction industry. I mean, two industries that are, you're reading every day about layoffs at Citicorp and Merrill Lynch approaching 10% of their workforce. The real estate industry is in tatters, and this adjustment is coming up with net additions to these two categories. So the GDP, the Q1 2008 rate under the BLS was a growth rate of 2.5% versus the shadow stats of minus 2.7. But the BLS growth rate is factored in using a GDP price deflator that miraculously is showing low to no inflation. So that explains why we're still showing growth. And then finally, the CPI, which is the most distorted of all of them, it's actually started to tick up at 5%, which even for mainstream economists is starting to seem alarmingly high. But the shadow stat CPI is 12.6%, a huge 760 basis point differential between what is reported and what might actually be the truth. The normal CPI has been played with so many times that we suggested in one of our letters that they might as well just forget all the gimmicks and start reporting the CPI X inflation, that might be a more realistic way to report inflation. So for example, it has substitution adjustments where if the cost of steak is going up much more than the cost of hamburgers used as the food in the index, or if the cost of one good is going up a lot, they make what's called a hedonic adjustment, where they assume that the quality of the good is much higher. So even though the price has gone up, it gets downgraded in price because it's supposed to be a higher quality experience. So maybe even if gas is going up at a high rate, maybe the driving with the GPS and satellite radio is a more pleasurable experience, so they can adjust the energy number down. So I look at these stats and say, Goldilocks, my expletive deleted, we look to me like we're in a bad stagflationary environment with high unemployment and high inflation. Okay, I'll try to move along more quickly. Category 2, I call this category pompous prognostication. Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae are adequately capitalized. That was almost the verbatim quote of Secretary of the Treasury Paulson. 2 days later, he announced a massive bailout of these companies that I guess need to raise a lot of capital for losses that they said they didn't have. Category 3, this is just abject economic ignorance. That's what I call this category. Commodity prices rise due to speculators rather than fundamental forces of supply and demand. Financial asset prices are declining due to short selling and rumor mongers having nothing to do with malinvestments, excess leverage, and bubble prices on the way up. Subprime crisis is the fault of predatory lenders taking advantage of helpless victims. It had nothing to do with the enormous growth of the government-sponsored enterprises and the Federal Reserve inflation of the money supply. Next category, I call this category semantic distortion. If all else fails, just change what you call the category. So now it's not called a bailout. The actual political verbiage is temporary contingency rescue plan. Market crashes aren't called that anymore. They're just called corrections. Depressions are called slowdowns. Government-manipulated markets, which is what we've had a lot of this year, are now called stable and orderly markets. Fascist cartelist, which appears to be the main job description of the Federal Reserve Bank. Instead, they're now being called, in the latest legislation and interviews, world-class regulator. That's what the new moniker of the Federal Reserve Bank is. And then finally, in addition to semantic distortion, we have semantic manipulation, which is to add the word emergency or fairness in the legislative title, and you'll be sure to accomplish your objective. So here I have some kind of funny digression, I think, on fairness and emergency. I went to this website called www.govtrack.us, which tracks really all of the bills pending in Congress, and you can look up a particular congressman or senator on that website and see what their voting record has been, how often they've showed up to vote. It's an amazing website. So I just went on it about a week ago and did a word search, and I put the word fairness in that website, and was amazed to find that for the latest congressional session, just the 07-08 12-month period that's about to end, I got spit back 9 single pages of bills that contain the word fairness in the label of the bill. And some of these, truth is stranger than fiction. Here are some of these, and I'm not making these up. The Football Fairness Act of 2007, coming from New England, which is a sports dynasty. I'm presuming that might be a bill that forces the New England Patriots to kick off from the 20-yard line every time they score a touchdown. There's the Motorsports Tax Fairness Act of 2007, the Family Fairness Act of 2007, which probably will tell me whether I should pay my sons and daughter equal allowance money. And then my personal favorite, the Menopausal Hormone Fairness Act of 2007. I don't know if that was a friend of Elliot Spitzer that passed that act, but that was in there. So my next search was the word emergency, and that was actually much more productive. I ended up in not 9 pages, but 11 pages of single-spaced bills that had emergency in the title, and I won't go over many of these, but I just have to highlight one, which was called the Emergency Contraception Education Act of 2007, which I think was a different bill sponsor than the menopausal legislation, but they both occurred in the same session. To my chagrin, I then, just to end this part of the discussion, I inputted the word simplification to see how many pages of bills have that in the title, and unfortunately it was only 2 or 3 pages, so I was a bit disappointed, but it still contained the following gem that I think's as good as any. This is an actual bill, the Simplification Through Additional Reporting Tax Act of 2007. So I'm not sure how additional reporting is simplifying it. I described some of these titles to a friend of mine, and they said, are the people in D.C., are they evil or are they morons? And I kind of debate that with myself a lot, and I think I finally concluded, we talked about this at lunch today, that they're evil morons. So I don't think I can, I think they're both. Okay, finally I want to defend a few market undefendables in homage to Walter Block. I think if, 2 of the best and most, in some ways, I don't know if simplest is the right adjective, but two of the best books I've read on economics ever are Economics in One Lesson and then Defending the Undefendables. I mean, I think if you read those 2 books, you really could dispense with economic education at virtually every Ivy League institution and be way ahead of any graduate of those institutions. So I'd like to defend some of the so-called market indefendables. Short sellers, also called bear raiders, corporate activists, often referred to in the press as pirates, distressed bond investors, often called vulture investors, high-yield financiers, often called junk bond predators or loan sharks. It's funny. We manage money from a quiet little office. Most of our managers are kind of nerdy types with a computer in front of them on the phone calling managements or going out and visiting companies and doing a lot of hard legwork. But you read this and you would think that we're kind of invested with dinosaurs and really evil monsters and bad animals. I mean, our world seems extremely safe. All of these have in common, they're given a evil-sounding moniker that practically condemns them before you can even defend them logically. So they're vilified in the press and by politicians. 2, they, in all cases, are up against tremendous statutory and regulatory obstacles. 3, all of these activities entail a fair amount of risk being assumed. They're not riskless activities. Short selling is much more dangerous than going long a company. Being a corporate activist is a expensive and risky proposition to undertake. Investing as distressed bond investors do, and companies that are going through a bankruptcy or liquidation process is not the easiest kind of investing. It's much easier to invest in a Microsoft than it is to invest in an Enron bankruptcy. And then high-yield financiers are often lending money to companies that might be early in their life cycle or that can't get financing from conventional equity and bank sources. So it's all of these actors fight various obstacles and take on risky activities. And so let's just look at I think they're actually heroic. I think they're more than defendable. They're actually heroic. Short sellers, for example, fight uptake rules, take on enormous risk. They're blamed for market falls. They're called anti-American. They're up against managements who are often very promotional and can use vast corporate resources to fight them or to sue them. But I think they're heroic. They expose fads, frauds, and failures. They provide liquidity in a down market because short sellers ultimately have to cover their positions. And finally, they aid the price discovery process. They make markets a lot more efficient because they're counteracting a lot of the fluff that you see from Wall Street analysts trying to pump up securities. I mean, they're really on the other side of Mad Money Kramer. Activists deal with all kinds of legal obstacles. There are state anti-takeover statutes. There's the Williams Act, which is a federal act that requires that they disclose what they're doing. But to me, they're heroic. They are the essential means for corporate control. They keep managements honest. The threat of an activist keeps managements from being too entrenched in their position, so that they, to me, are real heroes. And I'm not sure what's to be moaned by a shareholder that's faced with an activist making a offer on a company. They're usually offering a premium of 40 to 50% of the current market price to be paid immediately. So to me, that's a pretty good deal in most cases. Distressed bond investors, also called vultures, they fight numerous obstacles as well, but to me, they provide critical liquidity. Banks often, when they're faced with a bond they own that goes bankrupt, are often either mandated to get it off their books, or they don't want to go through the workout process. You might have a trade creditor that's supplied goods to a furniture maker that's gone bankrupt. The trade creditor doesn't want to be part of the bankruptcy process. They want to get their cash back as quickly as possible and not be going to creditor committees. So these vulture investors come in and buy the bonds at a cheap price, and they provide liquidity to those trade claimants or banks that don't want to be part of the process, and they help restructure the company as a going concern and lop off its debt and restructure the debt. And then finally, high-yield financing, which became popular during the Milken era. To me, this is just another source of capital for companies who might not be able to access it either in the equity markets or from traditional sources. The high-yield financiers also aid the market for corporate control. So to vilify them as predators or junk bond lenders, to me, seems extremely misguided, if not economically ignorant. Finally, I don't have too much else to say. I'll leave it to questions at this time, but if we started with some quotes from Mark Twain, I'd like to end with his intellectual heir from the 20th century, H.L. Mencken, and I think this is a motto that I try to live my life by, and I think it's really the credo of the Mises Institute. I believe that it is better to tell the truth than to lie. I believe that it is better to be free than to be a slave, and I believe that it is better to know than to be ignorant. With that, I'm honored to have been here, and honored and flattered at the attendance here, and we'll open it up to any questions anyone might have.
Can you speak to the Tier 3 assets that they were supposed to divulge last November, and I think they put it off another year? Do you know anything about that?
It's an accounting standard that's been mandated, and it has to deal with how you mark-to-market illiquid assets. I mean, there's all sorts of technicalities in the market, many of which have been regulatorily imposed. I mean, another is like the uptick rule, and to me, these are all. None of this should be really statutorily imposed. I mean, these should be standards that are developed by the marketplace or by their own trade associations or clearing associations. So it's hard for me to comment in the abstract whether something like the uptick rule or Tier 3 accounting are valid or invalid as a matter of law. I don't think they should be matters of law. I think they should be matters of kind of voluntary solutions in the marketplace.
I have a quick question. What do you recommend reading-wise, not economics in general, but contemporary like blogs from an Austrian point of view? Like I currently try to be Gary Northman from Rockwell or Mike Shedlock.
Yeah, we only.
You guys have a free newsletter?
No, we only subscribe to a handful of publications. We get Jim Grant's Interest Rate Observer. I think Jim has spoken down here before. We get one by Mark Faber, who has a lot of Austrian leanings. His is called the Boom, Doom, and Gloom Report, which and we get Fred Hickey's newsletter. It's called the High Tech Newsletter. It only costs like $150 a year. Others that we try to read, Jeremy Grantham's a provocative investment strategist. They have a website for their firm where you can get their newsletters. And then as far as investment books, there have only been a handful over time that I think are really good at explaining investment principles in philosophy. Seth Klarman wrote one called The Margin of Safety. Marty Whitman wrote one that's out of print called The Aggressive Conservative Investor. The Graham and Dodd original book is good. And then just read all of Buffett's annual letters. I mean, I think all of that would be plenty to really make you kind of an informed investor from understanding, coming up with a sound investment philosophy.
One quick follow-up. You mentioned you believe we're facing stagflation in at least the midterm, not deflation like Mike Shedlock and I know Gary knows. There are some prominent Austrian school investors that are predicting deflation, at least in the short term. Do you differ from them, or you're saying just in long-term stagflation?
I can't separate out the time element. I mean, I think you can have both, because you can have certainly different asset classes that went up at different rates, and you can, so we basically have had expanding money supply for a long time, so we're going to have high rates of inflation coupled with this debt bubble that has to be liquidated. So to me, it's not inconsistent that you can have the worst of all worlds occurring. I don't know if simultaneously is the right word or sequentially, but I don't know that they're mutually or logically inconsistent.
Probably the same as avoid trying to build more hard assets. Thank you.
In your experience during the time you've been involved in the financial community, have more people become receptive to Austrian economic insights, or has the proportion of people who are receptive stayed roughly the same?
It seems like the theory is cited in more and more places. I mean, just letters we get from managers that we have money with. I mean, I think the writings of Jim Grant and Mark Faber and Ron Paul's work, I think they've kind of seeped out there. So I think some of the Austrian theory on the credit cycle and the housing bubble appears to have shown up in financial publications to a much greater extent than was the case back in the 90s. I haven't tried to statistically tabulate that. That's just my kind of instinctive sense. But again, back to an earlier comment, I don't really think that Austrian economic theory can provide a useful framework in terms of making you skeptical about information or statistics, but I think the skills for being a great investor are ultimately not related to kind of any theory of economics. It's just a distinct skill that entails parsing through accounting statements, reviewing facts, meeting company managements, and making your own judgments about the price of securities relative to the cash flow and other prospects those investments might entail. I mean, Austrian economics might give you some sense of a macro risk environment that you're dealing in, and you might want to make sure your portfolio is sensitive to those kinds of risk. But fundamental investing, I think, is ultimately a separate discipline.
Obviously, the fact that it's there in the first place is causing the biggest problem, but do you see anyone who could take over as chairman of the Federal Reserve and within the short term stop the continuous bailouts and the just continuous progression of causing more problems like Bernanke's been doing?
Yeah, well, the best candidate would be Ron Paul, because he last year, actually, I went on that website. He did introduce a bill last summer to abolish the Federal Reserve, so he would be a great chairman, because he would either abdicate or hold no meetings or seek to abolish the office. But outside of that, I'm generally of the school that it's not so much I mean, I guess Volcker was much stronger than his successors, but I think it's more the institution than the person. I kind of feel that way about the presidency in most cases. I mean, there are minor shades of differences. I mean, Obama we'll get the greater welfare state with him, with McCain a greater warfare state, so it's kind of like that, what I think was a line in one of the Woody Allen movies, your choices between permanent destruction or abject misery or something like that. I mean, so I think it's more the institutional framework than who's occupying the position. That's my own view.
Great speech, by the way. Wonderful.
Thanks.
But, I have a have a corporate governance class, and we read this paper that only 30% of the investment managers actually read the statutes of incorporation before they invest in a stock of a company, and that seems to me horrendously bad. I know within portfolio theory you can potentially do away with that if you pick something close to the market portfolio, but what's your view on this? Should one care about the statutes of incorporation of a company, or does that matter at all from the strategy?
No, I mean, I think if you're investing in a common stock, you want to know the jurisdiction in which the corporation was incorporated, because that state will have various laws on poison pills or takeover-friendly or unfriendly statutes. I think most corporations still are incorporated in the state of Delaware, and so I would think that that law is pretty well known. I think that would be my sense.
Do you see any, foresee any sort of like reactionary legislation in the near term that may affect your business, obviously your industry specifically?
Yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of rumors floating out there. The SEC's a few weeks ago announced a ban on naked short selling that applied to 19 banks, the banks that happen to be going down the most in price prior to the order, and they've started to subpoena various hedge funds about their emails and trading activities in Bear Stearns stock prior to Bear Stearns' demise, trying to figure out whether it was those rumors that befell Bear Stearns rather than the corporate rot on its balance sheet. So there's definitely, the SEC is definitely in a mode now where it appears to be going after scapegoats. The legislation that could be passed either by the SEC administratively or by Congress could be one to require disclosure of short positions, and that would be extremely damaging to the long-short industry. I mean, shorts currently do not have to be disclosed on filings that you make under the federal securities law, and if a manager has to disclose that he's short a company, you can rest assured that he's not going to be doing much more shorting anymore. That's just a recipe for being out there hung to dry and getting squeezed, and you don't want managements to know you're short their stock. So that would be extremely detrimental to my industry, and it would be even more detrimental to capital markets, because as we said before, short selling is an extremely valuable part of capital markets, and if that's artificially constrained or impeded, that is not a good thing for capital markets.
So what are you doing in response? Are you...
we're just...
I mean, in a general sense, like, what are...
Well, I'm speaking here. I mean, I'm not...
Can you position yourself in a way...
Not really. I mean, we invest with managers that try to invest as best they can in an environment that's uncertain, where the government has become a much more difficult force to contend with. I think in general it makes what they've done in the last 12 months makes short selling much more difficult from a risk-return perspective, putting aside whether they're going to change the rules on disclosure or upticks and the cost of borrowing. Just the fact that there's this huge elephant out there now that can come in and bail out companies just makes you much more cautious about shorting a stock or when to take your profits. So I think our managers are just, in general, probably quicker to cover short sales than they might have been in the absence of a Federal Reserve and Treasury that seems to be wanting to give an open checkbook to the banking cartel.
Would you also defend shorting naked short selling?
I don't know if defend's the right word. I mean, naked shorting is the practice of trying to borrow and sell a stock that you haven't legally that you haven't arranged to borrow for. It'd be kind of akin to going long a stock, and before the 3-day settlement period transpires, you don't provide the cash. So, I mean, I think if you borrow a stock, you should make reasonable. If you short sell a stock, you have to make reasonable efforts to locate and get that borrow before the settlement period expires. So if you're engaging in a practice where you're shorting with no expectation of trying to borrow the stock, I mean, that to me is probably a form of fraud or something close to it. So.
So you would not be paying.
What has happened to Swiss bank secrecy legislation?
I don't know. I haven't followed. I haven't followed that issue. It's a good question though, because most of my capital is invested in our funds, which is the right way to align our interest with our investors. But I do have some gold coins for a small portion of my assets, and I was saying to Lou Rockwell at lunch that I need to do a lot more diligence because I just am storing those coins at a banking institution in Boston, and back in the 30s, gold coins were confiscated. So I need to find out whether I'm being imprudent in keeping those coins in a safe deposit box, whether I should build a safe in my house or find a Swiss bank or a place like that to store them. So I have to confess that I haven't been diligent on that issue.
I was just becoming more friendly with the manager of the bank. You said the quantitative analysis flaws in quantitative analysis. What kind of flaws can you expand on that?
Yeah, I think quantitative investing, it's basically only as good as the data that's inputted. So I kind of think it suffers from a lot of computer modeling, that it's typically from the flaw garbage in, garbage out. And to me, companies and investing is a dynamic profession, and the quantitative investing basically looks at past reported statistics about a company and then tries to put together a portfolio based on those metrics. Now, those metrics may on average work out over time, and maybe you can produce a acceptable or mediocre rate of return, but we're trying to find superior rates of return, and I think quantitative investing is garbage in, garbage out. It fails to catch inflection points in the fortunes of an individual company, and we're much more believers that fundamental investing, reading the footnotes, going beyond the footnotes, is much better than quantitative investing. Quantitative techniques, I think, are useful. They can help you screen ideas, and you need to be good quantitatively to be a good investor, but relying on a computer model to pick stocks without any human judgmental overlay, to me, is just a mediocre form of investing. We also don't use it for, not only because we think it's flawed, but we don't think that we as a firm are particularly adept at trying to figure out what's a good computer model versus what's a bad one. So if a manager that's using a quantitative technique starts to underperform, we have really no good way of assessing whether the model's broken or whether the manager is going to be able to fix it. So we basically have concluded that those kinds of techniques, besides being flawed in our judgment, are somewhat outside of our circle of competence in being able to understand them.
So, like, as far as maybe use quantitative to screen out a small class that you're normally working with, or
Well, we pick other managers, so we're a fund of funds. So there are firms like us that get databases of past performance statistics of investment managers and try to put together a portfolio that way. And we don't even do that. We get ideas from word of mouth, or going to conferences, or talking to limited partners, or just through our collective experience. And but our underlying managers that use quantitative techniques might just be using them to run simple screens. Give me a list of 50 stocks trading at their 52-week low that have a price-to-book ratio below X, or that have free cash flow above Y, and that might just give them a working list of securities that might look interesting and that are then worthy of further security analysis and fundamental research.
Are you
The good thing about what we do, I have to kind of separate my own view about markets and economies from what our fund is trying to do, which is kind of a separate thing. Most of the managers that we allocate capital to have very modest to negligible net exposure in the markets in which they're invested. And so by net exposure, that's defined as the percent they're long, percent they own something versus percent they're short or betting against something. So we might have a manager that has 30% of their capital invested in U.S. equities, but they're short 20% of capital in U.S. equities. So their net exposure to any one market tends to be modest. And the good thing about that is that it means in a lot of ways we don't have to rely on market direction or a market viewpoint to generate our results, as long as our managers can find stocks or assets that are cheaply valued, either in an absolute sense or relative to what they're short, we can generate a decent rate of return. But in general, my macro viewpoint is that the credit bubble was a global bubble. It started in the U.S. was kind of the driver, but it's extended everywhere. Equity valuations are not nearly as stretched in a lot of the European markets. They've been beaten down more harshly than our market has this year. But the credit bubble, which is the big bubble to contend with, is a global phenomenon to varying degrees in different markets, but it's a global phenomenon. So I'm not a believer that certain markets are likely to decouple over the next 5 years.
As a libertarian, do you have any moral conflicts about investing in companies that are aided by the government in any great sense, or do you not worry too much about that?
I don't worry, because I think virtually probably every single company out there is both aided and harmed by the government to varying degrees. I mean, there's so many statutes that are at root protectionist or keep potential competition out that you could kind of argue that every company we invest with is benefited to some degree by government in theory. So we just pick investment managers, and I leave most of my moralizing to the Mises Institute. I mean, we ourselves refrain from engaging in what we think would be a moral activity. We're transparent to our clients. We tell them when we hire a manager how much money we have invested in our fund. So we try to conduct ourselves as to our own standard of high ethical integrity. But that's I think good enough for now.
On a similar note, how do you feel about managing money for places like Princeton who don't hold these beliefs, and making money for them, and kind of helping them along when they're espousing statism?
I probably review the investment function pretty narrowly and separate from that. I mean, I think if I applied that test, probably the Mises Institute would be the only investment committee that I would serve on, and I guess I just have not been that purist. I think there are a lot of good things that Princeton does do, so I haven't taken it to that step. I'm probably not a moral beacon to this crowd based on the answers to these questions.
Well, in your defense, to say that to give money to Princeton or to manage their money is somehow wrong would be a collectivist perspective. It would assume that Princeton is a single entity,
Right.
and all it does is uniformly bad in states.
Right.
In fact, there are probably a lot of good people in
Right.
Princeton who advance free markets.
Right, including me. I don't know if it's, if we have time for one more, then maybe I'm going to stay for dinner and I'm happy to take any in a casual setting. But
I would just like to know, you were an English major?
yes.
And you have used both and really like that about it. How has that influenced your way of looking at investment and financing? Have you taken some away from that? Some like the way authors view the world?
Oh, I think being English literature major enabled me to read and enjoy good books, and that was about that was about it. It was about someone's. I used to be a lawyer, and I went to law school, and I hated law school. And someone said, "Well, but you owe so much to it. It made you, disciplined and logical." And I said, I think I was that way before I went to law school. I think law school probably got in the way of that process, and I was anal before I went to law school. The way I looked at it, I didn't like law school. I didn't like practicing law, so I shouldn't have done those things. I don't know. I probably, in retrospect, I might have enjoyed being a history major, or might have gotten more out of that than being an English major, although on the other hand, if I'd been a history major, the extent to which I would have to unlearn what I was taught in college would be that much greater. There's not too much damage that can be done just by reading, fiction. It's a lot. I think a lot more can be done probably than being taught from mainstream economists or historians. I mean, I was saying to Tom DiLorenzo before this, there was a review in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, a new book, Ranking the Presidents, and I read the title, and I said, oh, this could be interesting. And I read the first paragraph. The guy comes up with this quantitative system of ranking the presidents where 30 is a perfect score, and the review said the only president to get a perfect score of 30 was Abraham Lincoln. And I told this to Tom today at lunch, and he said, you would think that they could at least deduct a half a point for suspending the U.S. Constitution for the duration of the Civil War. But, thanks again.